all of them has a different geometrical shape. This is unique. So far we have.
In 34 BCE, Cleopatra had 4 healthy children. This should have been impossible. Her family had been marrying brothers and sisters since 276 BCE, stacking genetic problems generation after generation. European royal houses collapsed under less inbreeding. Yet Cleopatra's line kept going. Scientists spent years trying to explain how she escaped the curse. Then, in 2025, new DNA evidence surfaced that flipped the entire story. The real horror wasn't in her genes at all. It was something far worse, something Rome tried to hide for 2,000 years. It all began after the death of Alexander the Great, when one of his most trusted generals, Ptolemy the Fervent Soter, stepped forward and took control of Egypt in 305 BCE. He did not just rule as a king, he ruled as something more. He claimed divine status, borrowing the ancient image of Egyptian pharaohs who were seen as living gods. That single choice quietly changed everything, because when power becomes sacred, family becomes dangerous. His son, Ptolemy II, pushed the idea even further. In 276 BCE, he married his full sister, Arsinoe. To Greeks, this was shocking. Brother and sister marriage was deeply taboo. But in Egypt, the story sounded different. The royal court pointed to the gods. Osiris and Isis were siblings. They were also husband and wife. If the gods could do it, so could kings. Soon, Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II were worshipped as living deities, known as the sibling gods. Temples were built, coins were struck. What started as symbolism became policy. Royal incest was no longer a rumor, it was law. And once it began, it did not stop for nearly 275 years. Arsinoe II was not a quiet partner in this system. She ruled beside her brother with a sharp mind and a ruthless edge. Ancient writers whispered that she poisoned her stepchildren to remove rivals and secure her power. Whether every detail is true or not, the pattern was clear. Murder inside the family became normal. Power had to stay pure. Blood had to stay close. Even after her death, her face appeared on temples and coins, reminding Egypt that divine rulers did not fade easily. As generations passed, incest was no longer just tradition. It became official policy. By the 3rd century BCE, the Ptolemies were openly marrying siblings to imitate divine unions. At first, the damage was subtle: reduced fertility, sickly heirs, quiet weaknesses that did not yet break the system. Egypt was still rich. The Nile still fed trade. Gold still flowed. So the warnings were ignored. Recessive traits stacked quietly in the bloodline, generation after generation, while the dynasty told itself it was preserving perfection. Then came Ptolemy VIII. His reign exposed what the system had become. In 142 BCE, he married his sister, Cleopatra II. Then he married her daughter, Cleopatra III, both at the same time. The palace exploded. Civil war followed. Cleopatra II rebelled. Ptolemy VIII answered with cruelty that shocked even hardened courts. He mutilated his own son for disloyalty. Family paranoia had turned into open horror. Incest was no longer just a symbol of divine rule. It was a machine that produced fear, violence, and collapse. By the time Rome controlled Egypt, sibling marriage had spread beyond royalty. Census records from Roman Egypt show that nearly 1 out of every 4 marriages in some regions was between full siblings. Over time, some lethal genes were wiped out, but others piled up. Cleopatra VII would be born into this gamble. By her era, the royal family shared blood so closely that their inbreeding levels matched children born from full brother and sister unions. And yet, strangely, they survived longer than other inbred dynasties. The reasons are still debated: strong early genetics, favorable climate, a rich Mediterranean diet. Whatever the cause, the Ptolemies endured longer than logic suggested. Cleopatra VII entered this world in 69 BCE. She was the daughter of Ptolemy XIV, and almost certainly his sister wife Cleopatra V. Because of this, Her family tree folded in on itself. She had only 2 pairs of great-grandparents instead of 8. Her childhood unfolded in chaos. Her father bribed Roman senators with 6,000 talents of silver to keep his throne. Riots over famine forced her mother into exile in 58 BCE. When her father returned with Roman backing, her aunt Berenice IV was executed for seizing power. Cleopatra learned early that family meant nothing when crowns were at stake. Despite the bloodline risks, Cleopatra was brilliant. She spoke multiple languages. She understood people. She understood danger. She studied at Alexandria's great center of learning and became obsessed with poisons, testing them on condemned prisoners to learn how they worked and how to survive them. Knowledge, in her world, was protection. When her father died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was only 18. Tradition forced her into marriage with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. Real power quickly slipped from her hands. His advisors feared her intelligence and ambition. By 49 BCE, she was exiled. She fled Egypt in disguise, slipping past assassins, moving through Syria, gathering mercenaries, building an army while pretending to disappear. While she waited, her enemies tried to erase her. Coins were minted without her face. Her name was removed, but Cleopatra refused to vanish. She wrote letters. She built alliances. She prepared her return. In 48 BCE, she made the move that changed history. Smuggled into a palace in Alexandria, wrapped in linen, she came face to face with Julius Caesar. He was 52. She was 21. Her boldness stunned him. Her mind held him. Caesar backed her claim. Egypt shifted overnight. She gave birth to Caesarion in 47 BCE and declared him Caesar's son. Rome panicked. Senators whispered. Power trembled. Later, when Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra fled Rome with her child, sensing death in the air. Back in Egypt, she removed the last obstacle. Her brother Ptolemy XIV died suddenly. Poison was suspected. Caesarion was named co-ruler. Cleopatra now stood alone at the center. She rebuilt Egypt's economy. She reformed taxes. She paid down massive debts. She built fleets. She styled herself as Isis, blending politics with divinity. She allied with Mark Antony, and in doing so, placed herself directly in the path of Rome's rising power. In the spring of 44 BCE, Cleopatra sailed up the Cydnus River toward Tarsus and turned a political summons into a quiet kind of conquest. She did not arrive as a frightened client queen. She came on a golden barge with purple sails, silver oars dipping in time with the music, and the air thick with perfume and flowers. She lay under a golden canopy, dressed as Aphrodite, with girls around her acting as nymphs, and musicians playing flutes and harps. Young men costumed as Eros stood nearby and fanned her while attendants sent waves of scent toward the riverbank crowds. Mark Antony had called her there to answer questions about loyalty, but as the barge drew closer, he found himself waiting for her. She did not go to his banquet. She made him come to her. Ancient writers such as Plutarch and Appian remembered this as a lesson in power and image. Tarsus was a serious Roman military base. Yet in that moment, the city watched a queen who seemed to control not just ships and soldiers, but even light, sound, and smell. Antony, a man who liked to see himself as a figure close to the gods, met a woman who stepped into that same space without asking permission. From that first meeting, their alliance and their romance began to grow. Soon, Antony set aside his Parthian plans and followed Cleopatra back to Egypt. During the winter of 41 to 40 BCE, he stayed in Alexandria, where the two created a private world that felt both playful and dangerous. They formed a society that they called the Inimitable Livers. Every night there were feasts, drinking, and games. They threw dice, went hunting, and played tricks on the city. Some stories say they dressed as servants and slipped into the streets to tease and watch ordinary people. Plutarch wrote that this group lived in constant indulgence and excess. The name itself carried a message. They believed no one else could match their way of life. Word of these nights spread back to Rome, where people whispered that Cleopatra had sunk Antony in luxury and made him forget duty. After Antony lost at Actium, the inimitable livers faded and were replaced by another circle called the Society of Partners in Death, a darker version that kept feasting even as their world began to fall apart. The names, the games, and the stories all helped build an image of a couple who refused to live by Roman rules. Cleopatra understood how a single moment could become legend. At one banquet, she told Antony she could spend 10 million sesterces on one meal. To prove it, she did not order gold plates or rare animals. Instead, she reached for one of her own earrings. Each one held an enormous pearl. She took one pearl, dropped it into a cup of vinegar, and then drank it. Pliny the Elder later explained that pearls are made of calcium carbonate. In contact with acetic acid, which is the active part of vinegar, this material can turn into calcium acetate, water, and carbon dioxide. Modern experiments show a whole pearl does not vanish in seconds. It dissolves over days. So Cleopatra likely crushed it first to speed the reaction. Even so, the point was clear. The pearl was valued at about 10 million sesterces, which roughly lines up with around $10 million in modern terms. Pliny and later writers kept retelling this story because it showed more than wealth. Cleopatra turned chemistry into theater and used one piece of jewelry to show how easily she could consume what others would guard for generations. Everyone at that table, including Antony, saw what she was willing to do to prove a point. Behind the parties and stunts, real lives were changing. In 40 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. They named them Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. The names Sun and Moon hinted at how their parents thought of themselves. Antony then did something that shocked Rome. He admitted in public that the twins were his children. He was already married to Octavia, the sister of Octavian, who would later become Augustus. Octavia was carrying his child at the time. By turning away from her and from that Roman marriage to stand with Cleopatra and their twins, Antony broke more than a household. He crossed a line in Roman public life. Many in Rome saw it as an insult to Octavia and as proof that Antony valued a foreign queen over a Roman wife. Octavian later used this choice against him, pointing to it as evidence that Antony had lost all sense of Roman duty. Their bond was not only personal. Cleopatra and Antony also built a military partnership. In 34 BCE, they launched a campaign against Armenia. Cleopatra helped by supplying around 500 ships and large amounts of money and grain. Antony led the army on land while Cleopatra handled sea support and logistics. Together they managed to bring Armenia under their control, and Antony did not celebrate this in Rome. He held a triumph in Alexandria instead, another choice that enraged people in the capital. Cleopatra's fleet also helped in the siege of Samosata, where careful naval movements helped outthink Parthian forces. Later accounts, such as those in reference works, remark that this level of military involvement from a queen was unusual. Cleopatra was not only a consort, she joined in planning and supplying campaigns, and used Egypt's resources to lift Antony's position in the eastern Mediterranean. Their growing power worried Octavian, who watched from Rome as their influence in the east kept expanding. The royal house behind Cleopatra carried its own long story of risk. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a habit of brother and sister marriages. This would keep property and titles inside the family, but it also raised the risk of genetic problems. Many royal children in the line suffered illnesses or died young. Even so, Cleopatra and Antony had two more children together. Their younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was born around 36 BCE, and Cleopatra Selene, the twin of Alexander Helios, had been born in 40 BCE. In spite of the heavy inbreeding in the dynasty, these children seem to have been healthy, probably helped by the mix of Antony's Roman blood with the Ptolemaic line. By 30 BCE, however, the family's power was collapsing. Romans painted Cleopatra as an Eastern witch who had ruined Antony and ended a royal house. After Cleopatra's death, Octavian had Ptolemy Philadelphus killed, and with that act, the main royal bloodline ended. Cleopatra's children were moved to Rome, and none would rule Egypt. The old pattern of inbreeding and internal rivalry had left very few strong branches. Roman hostility then finished what time and genetics had begun. One of the clearest signs of their challenge to Rome came in 34 BCE in Alexandria. Antony staged what became known as the Donations of Alexandria. In a huge ceremony, he sat beside Cleopatra and presented a new picture of power to the world. Cleopatra was crowned as Nea Isis, the new Isis, and their children received far-stretching territories. Caesarion, the son she had with Julius Caesar, was given the title King of Kings. Alexander Helios received Armenia, Media, and Parthia. Cleopatra Selene was given Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus received Syria, Phoenicia, and Cilicia. Cleopatra herself was called Queen of Kings and ruler of Egypt. None of this had the approval of Roman law. Antony was handing out lands that Rome claimed as its own. During the ceremony, he appeared dressed in the style of Dionysus, while Cleopatra took the role of Isis. Captured Armenian royals were forced to walk in the procession as trophies. News of this reached the Roman Senate and produced fury. To them, this looked like treason, a sign that Antony wanted to move the center of power away from Rome and into Alexandria. The ceremony did not stand alone. Around it grew festivals and rituals that mixed Greek, Egyptian, and political religion. Antony and Cleopatra appeared before crowds as gods of wine and fertility and as a living Isis. People treated Cleopatra as Isis made flesh, which fit older Egyptian views of queens but clashed with Roman ideas about rulers. At public events, they sat on golden thrones with their children beside them while people watched and offered prayers. Rumors began to swirl that their private life also followed the old Ptolemaic pattern of incest. Most of this came from gossip and Roman suspicion, but it fed the picture of a couple who lived beyond normal rules. Coins from that period even showed their faces with features and titles that hinted at divine status. Each coin in a Roman hand became another piece of proof in the story that Antony had fallen under foreign or magical control. Octavian saw how powerful images and stories could be and fought back with his own plans. He created a picture of Antony and Cleopatra that would turn Rome against them. One of his sharpest moves came when he obtained a copy of Antony's will, which had been stored in the Temple of Vesta. He had this will read aloud in the Senate. According to those accounts, the will left large parts of Rome's eastern territories to Cleopatra and their children and asked to be buried in Alexandria beside her. This was exactly the kind of act that would anger Roman senators. Octavian also had Cleopatra portrayed as a twisted foreign queen in speeches and on coins. Statues and busts of her were shown as frightening or strange. People were told that she wanted to rule from Alexandria over Rome, that she used magic, and that Antony was her captive rather than her partner. By the time open war arrived, many in Rome had already decided that Cleopatra was an enemy who had to be destroyed. Political struggle wrapped around family danger. In 46 BCE, several years before her story with Antony reached its peak, Cleopatra had already shown how far she would go to protect her throne. Her half-sister Arsinoe IV had once been paraded in chains during Julius Caesar's triumph in Rome. Later, Arsinoe stayed at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. Cleopatra feared that this sister could become a rival claimant if Rome ever chose to use her. So, she persuaded Antony to order Arsinoe's execution right at the temple. Many people saw this as a shocking act because temples were meant to give safety. The killing showed the darker side of Ptolemaic rule, where siblings often died so one person could sit on the throne. Every time Cleopatra removed a rival, she also narrowed the pool of possible heirs. At the same time, she had to keep Egypt itself alive. Egypt supplied much of Rome's grain, and in years of bad harvests, this made Egyptian rulers extremely important. Cleopatra used that power carefully. She controlled when grain ships left and where they went, which helped her bargain with Roman leaders and guard her own position. She also tried to strengthen Egypt's economy from within. Accounts describe her overseeing public works, ports, and canals that made it easier to move crops and goods. She carried out currency changes and issued coins with her image and titles, making sure people understood that the state and the queen were tightly linked. Yet the same narrow family line that had put her on the throne also made future plans hard. As more relatives disappeared through murder or illness, there were fewer possible successors if she fell. The dynasty stood on her and on a handful of children. Once she was gone, the structure had nothing solid to rest on. During the great ceremonies in Alexandria, Antony swore public oaths to Isis beside Cleopatra. These acts pulled religion, loyalty, and politics together in a way that worried Romans. The coins that showed Antony and Cleopatra as divine did not just honor them. They also suggested a different order, where rulers answered to Egyptian gods rather than Roman traditions. This made it easy for Octavian to speak of witchcraft and foreign spells. He said Antony had broken with Roman values and followed a queen who called herself a goddess. Each accusation gave him more moral cover to start the final war. The path from those oaths and coins led straight toward the Battle of Actium and the fall of the Republic. On 2 September 31st BCE, everything came to a head near Actium in the Ionian Sea. Octavian's fleet, with Marcus Agrippa in command, faced the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Antony had more ships, many of them large and heavily armed. Octavian, however, had crews that were better trained and vessels that could move more sharply. Cleopatra commanded her own squadron with around 60 ships and brought her treasure on board as well. As the fighting grew intense, Cleopatra suddenly turned her squadron and sailed away toward Egypt. Antony saw her purple sails move away and made a rapid choice. He left his flagship and followed her, leaving much of his fleet and army behind. By the end of the battle, about 40 of his ships had sunk, and more than 120 had been captured. Actium broke their power at sea and opened the way for Octavian to take Egypt. It also gave their enemies a simple story to tell. The foreign queen had fled, and the Roman general had chased her, abandoning his men. After Actium, they retreated to Alexandria. Each day brought worse news. In August 30th BCE, Antony heard a report that Cleopatra had died. This was not true, but he believed it. In despair, he fell on his own sword. The wound did not kill him at once. Servants carried him to the entrance of the mausoleum where Cleopatra had shut herself in. She had him pulled up to her using ropes and did what she could to ease the pain, using what ancient writers call Egyptian arts. This may have meant herbal mixtures or other methods to soften his final hours. She held him and mourned out loud until he died. The scene, recorded by Plutarch and others, joined politics with theater once more. The great Roman commander died in the arms of the Egyptian queen, not on a battlefield. In the months before her own death, Cleopatra had already begun preparing for the end. Plutarch tells how she tested poisons on prisoners who were already condemned. She tried hemlock and other substances. She also used snake bites, watching how quickly they worked and how much suffering they caused. Her aim was not cruelty for its own sake. She wanted to know how to die without long agony, in a way that still suited a queen. In these tests, she eventually settled on the venom of an asp, probably a form of Egyptian cobra, because reports said it brought a calm, sleep-like passing. When Octavian finally took Alexandria and she saw that she would be dragged through Rome in chains, she used what she had learned. The exact method remains debated, but the ancient tradition holds that she let the snake bite her and 2 servants. In that way, she chose her own end, rather than allow her enemies to stage it. When Octavian took control of Egypt, He also took control of Cleopatra's children. Alexander Helios, Ptolemy Philadelphus, and Caesarion all fell into his hands. Caesarion, who was about 17, was killed. The usual explanation was that there could not be two sons of Caesar alive when one man wanted to rule alone. The younger boys were taken to Rome. Cleopatra begged Octavian to spare them and told him she would rather walk in his triumph, chained and humiliated, than see her children treated as trophies. He refused. In his victory parade, her children were shown in golden chains. This public display of the sons and daughter of a defeated queen told everyone in Rome that Egypt now belonged fully to the new regime. Soon after, the children disappear from most records. Their lives ended quietly compared to the noise around their mother. The kingdom she had tried to reform did not survive her. Octavian's men stripped the treasury and pulled down her systems. 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule ended in a short wave of seizures and new laws. Egypt became a Roman province and a private domain of the new emperor. The grain that Cleopatra had once used to bargain now moved under Roman control. Her coins, laws, and projects lost force. What remained were stories and the lasting Roman habit of explaining her rule through slander. The longer story of inbreeding in her dynasty drew new attention many centuries later. The Ptolemies married brothers and sisters and close kin again and again. Genetic researchers use a number called the inbreeding coefficient to describe this. Estimates for Cleopatra's family place her between 0.25 and 0.35, which means about a quarter to a third of her genes could have come from the same recent ancestors. First cousins usually show a value of 0.0625. Even the often mentioned Charles II of Spain reached only about 0.25. This kind of close matching raises the risk of inherited problems. Many royal houses in history suffered from this, and the Ptolemies were no exception. Yet Cleopatra herself seems to have escaped the worst effects. She was able to bear 4 children and did not show the severe disabilities seen in some later European rulers. Recent viral claims in 2025 that she was 45% inbred turn out to be mistaken. Actual genetic work does not have any remains from Cleopatra herself to test. A key point often missed is that the modern studies use other bones, not hers, and look at patterns in the whole family, rather than exact numbers for the queen. For many years, a skull found in 1929 at Ephesus was believed to belong to Arsinoe IV. This seemed to offer a way to study the family's DNA. In 2025, however, a team led by Gerhard Weber at the University of Vienna used new scanning and genetic methods on the bones. Microcomputed tomography showed that the skull came from a child, not a young woman. DNA testing revealed a Y chromosome, which means it belonged to a boy. Radiocarbon dates placed his life between 36 and 205 BCE. The bones had signs of a developmental problem and clear marks of severe vitamin D deficiency. The teeth showed interglobular dentin that often appears with rickets. The shape of the jaw suggested he had trouble chewing and likely lived with constant pain. He probably grew up in a Roman city where sunlight was limited by close buildings and diet was poor. For decades, people had tied that skull to royal intrigue. The new work shifted the story. It became proof of how hard life could be for an ordinary child in the ancient world, and a reminder of how easily science can be steered by old hopes and guesses. Cleopatra's own story holds both science and politics. She managed to have 4 children in a line that many thought doomed by inbreeding, yet their end came from war, not from illness. Caesarion died at 17 when Octavian chose to erase any rival claim from the blood of Julius Caesar. The others fell away in captivity or through political killings. When people look for horror in her genes, they often miss the real horror that cut her line. It was steel, rope, and decree rather than biology. The image of Cleopatra that most people know today was shaped less by her actions and more by the men who defeated her. Octavian's propaganda machine painted her as a dangerous seductress who used strange rites of Isis to control Antony and pull Rome into her web. Later writers, including Shakespeare, kept this picture alive. It was exciting and easy to stage. The reality behind it shows a woman who spoke at least 9 languages and was likely the first of her house to speak Egyptian as well as Greek. She argued with generals and senators, managed trade routes and coinage, and steered a country through famine and heavy Roman pressure. She worked as a diplomat, a strategist, and an economic planner at the same time. Those details were pushed aside because the story of a sorceress queen was more useful to her enemies and more memorable on stage. Despite everything, parts of her legacy did not vanish. Her daughter Cleopatra Selene was taken to Rome after her mother's death and walked in Octavian's triumph. But later she married Juba II, king of Numidia and Mauritania. In North Africa, she became a queen in her own right. Their son, Ptolemy, carried both Berber and Ptolemaic blood, and sat on a throne that joined African and Mediterranean worlds. Over time, intermarriage with Roman and Berber elites spread the line further. Some modern studies of royal and noble families in that region suggest traces of this old bloodline long after Egypt fell. Her other sons likely died quietly under Roman watch and left no clear record. Even so, the branch that moved west allowed her family to shape North African history for generations. When people remember Cleopatra now, they often see costumes, kohl-lined eyes, and scenes of seduction. Beneath that stands a very different figure. She grew up in a family damaged by its own attempts to keep power, ruled a country that fed an empire, faced 2 of Rome's strongest leaders, and tried to use every tool she had, from chemistry at a banquet to coins in a market. She lost in the end, yet the force of her choices and the reach of her mind still show through the layers of rumor. Her life holds spectacle, cruelty, and tragedy, but it also holds stubborn intelligence that refused to bend quietly to the story others wanted to write.